Good morning, at least when I am recording this video. This is a little bit different from how I've been doing things. We're kind of on or in an intermediate, I guess you would say, position right now. But anyway, so here's a review for this is a review, my review for Soylent Green, which came out in 1973. So, so I finally watched Soylent Green for the first time in my entire life on January 26th of 2025. And despite hearing about it all my life and having the main plot spoiled for me decades ago, seriously, like as a child, the movie has always been in my orbit, and I just had never I had never seen it. And it wasn't until this year that I just finally sought it out. It was kind of strange in a way that I never saw it before. It's always been in the orbit of the type of movies I like to watch, but I just never got around to it. And even now, it seems to only really be available on Amazon. But I loved the idea of the plot, though I'm sort of a sucker for post-apocalyptic stories or that type of genre in general. Soylent Green was loosely based off of a story by the author Harry Harrison. The original book was called Make Room, Make Room. So, in some ways, they're completely different stories, though. And I think this is one of the more modern examples of a movie that was based off of a book that ended up being nothing like the original material. The changes to the story mainly show up in the idea or the concept of Soylent in general, in Soylent itself. So in the movie, there's Soylent Red, yellow, and blue, and Soylent Green is the newest kind of these manufactured pellets of food. So it's said to be made out of the plankton from the ocean, though later on in the movie this turns out not to be true. I watched this movie almost completely blind, quote unquote, if you want to call it that. I went into it not having seen any trailers, not having read any reviews. All I know is, of course, the main spoiler, which, excuse me, of course, Soylent Green is people. There's something, though, that I just love about the 70s and 80s era of film, where it just seems to capture the grittiness of cities, as was seen here in Soylent, really well. To me, this was on the same level. This was on the same level as other movies like Dawn of the Dead, Taxi Driver, and Day of the Dead with that gritty kind of feel. That's what I was imagining. Soylent is among the earlier films of that era which capture that grittiness or gritty dirtiness, which was reflected in some areas in real life. I think one of the reasons why Soylent has become a cult classic is because of the parts of the movie depicted in the dystopian scenarios that were already, of course, happening in real life. So, Soylent is supposed to take place in New York City in the year 2022, so 50 years after the film was recorded. Now, in 2025, 2022 was 3 years ago. And one line from the trailer that I watched later still rings true, where it said, "The year is 2022 and nothing works." And they got that right? You know, in 2022, nothing was made to last anymore. In 2023, we saw every single company nickel and diming us. In 2025, you saw people, or 2024, you saw people unable to pay for food. And I'm talking about in real life. And now, of course, art imitates life. Even in 1972, when this movie was made, recorded, there were struggles that people experienced. But it's just funny, right, how so much of that still rings true today. And I think obviously that's part of the way they wrote it. Though perhaps not as dramatic as depicted in the film, um, the year 2022 in real life, you did see people living in squalid, cramped conditions just to have a home. And you still see people on waiting lists just to potentially rent an apartment. Though the original story didn't have the furniture or escort concubines to it, the movie did. This is something that was not in the original story, but in the movie. And this isn't ever explained, by the way. Nobody ever talks about this one way or another. Not that I ever even saw in any of the trailers or the trailers that are available to watch today still. I really think some of this stems from just this time period of Hollywood where there was still this 60s spy detective kind of stink to everything. And there's, of course, the handsome cop gets the girl, or he has the option of a harem of girls. And, of course, the main demographic of the film was aimed towards men, not men and women. So perhaps the idea was to, quote unquote, try to show how women are oppressed in the future and only seen as objects like furniture. That comes with the apartment, you know? Women are just furniture that come with the apartment. But the more I thought about it, the concubine thing just doesn't make sense. I mean, if a woman can be bound by what apartment she comes with, then wouldn't that make houses more valuable? Would a woman come with property? You know, if someone's actually buying property and not renting it. Could a man marry one of these women and then take her out of the apartment? I think that there are a lot more questions that, of course, like I was asking, than what the writers bothered to think about. I see the dynamic with Thorn and the concubine Cheryl, which is just kind of a strange way to spell that name. That dynamic, if you even want to call it that, is something I think from that 60s spy movie era. I know that Thorn, who was played by Charlton Heston, was supposed to be the cool, manly detective that got with the pretty girl, but I just saw the coupling as odd. And Thorn, look, I know it was a different era. I just know it was a different time period, okay? But he looked like a caveman, okay? He looked like a caveman. I just didn't think he was very attractive. I was like, this is supposed to be the guy that's just with the chick. He's not very cute to me, but, you know, whatever. You know, that's just showbiz. Whatever. But it was just clear to me that Thorn was more of a symbol for what the everyman was supposed to aspire to be. In general, Soylent Green is an interesting example of this rather in-between period, though, of Hollywood, where there were a lot of traces of old Hollywood that started to work with the new Hollywood, or the Hollywood that we know today. Many of the actors in the cast for the movie have since passed on, and many, actually, this really blew my mind, many of the actors in the movie were born nearly 100 years ago from the time of this review, which was in February 2025. It seems that many of the cast members that were featured in Soylent Green, this was one of their last, if not their last film. Of course, this was the last movie for Edward G. Robinson, who had passed about 2 weeks after the film was finished recorded. Technically, the movie was released posthumously. And Edward G. Robinson, who played Saul Roth, who was Thorne's book, so to speak, Edward Robinson was born in 1897. So You know, granted, he was in his 70s when he passed away, but it's like, wow, you know, there were actors in this movie that were born in the 1800s, you know, and for someone like me, born in the 1900s, I was born in the 1990s, hearing about somebody that was like, oh yeah, I was born in 1897, it just sounds like, wow, that's so crazy. It sounds so old and far away. You know, that was almost 100 years before I was born. And yet, my point is that there were actors born in the 1800s that played in this movie that is supposed to be depicting the time period now. And that kind of just blew my mind, where it's like, here I am watching Soylent Green post 2022, the year that was supposed to be depicted in the movie. I hope you understand what I mean. Like, just that idea in general blew my mind. You know, this movie unintentionally spans over 100 years because of the people that worked on it and played in it, and then the years that it's supposed to be depicting and showing. And then here I am in real life talking about this and reviewing this, you know, 50, you know, some years afterwards. It's a very interesting time. It's a very interesting time. So, anyway, there are parts to the movie that have nuance that I really did like. The scenes where the characters were to relish in, like, the real food that was on the table and washing in clean water with a big cake of soap. You know, at first you kind of think, like, what are they doing? Like, dude, who cares, right? Who cares about this wimpy lettuce, right? But you think, you know, for example, Saul Roth is like, you know, I haven't seen this in decades. You know, this used to be what it was like when I was born, right? And then you have Thorne, who's never apparently even seen lettuce. And he doesn't even think of it as anything special. And these pleasures that seem normal to us and we take for granted are things in the movie that, you know, are like high luxury, you know. In real life, there's many people who don't have clean water. In real life, there's people who don't even have soap, you know. And in real life, there are people who only rely on prepackaged food. And it's not because of, you know, maybe being hard-headed or something. There are people who live in such remote areas they don't have fresh food to eat. And this is in real life right now, you know. So, of course, this is a reality today in real life. Surely it was also like this in the 70s, too. And in a way, that is one of the greatest parts about science fiction in general, the genre, in that it allows writers to talk about subjects that are relevant to current times while using the imagery of an alternate world. Surely this is why the film, I think, is still talked about today and regarded as one of those movies you must see. I did think it was really clever how Simonson's final dialogue was written. On the first watch, you're left probably confused and a little clueless, and then on reflection, it makes sense. You know, if you don't know the spoiler, if you don't know what Soylent Green is made out of, at first you don't know or understands why Simonson is saying the things he is, right? You're left confused, clueless, and then later on it makes sense. And there's parts I went back to, rewatched after finishing the movie, and I give them credit, the writers credit, for the various things that seemed so simple at first, or directors, everybody. I just give them credit for the initially simple things that proved to be more clever than initially thought. And though overall, I don't know if I would rewatch the movie all alone, to me it seems like the kind of movie you play with a group of friends if someone hasn't watched it yet. And I feel like the shocking secret known at the end is revealed in a way that only makes the movie worth watching once, actually. I'm not trying to be negative, but the way this movie honestly ends and reveals the secret, the way this movie is written to sort of hide the secret. It just doesn't have very much replay value to me. I think the ending to the movie is pretty interesting, though, in how it's sort of open-ended. The way the credits roll, it seems applied to me that they sent Thorn, home. Personally, I don't see the ending for him, or it ending for him in any other way. I think that they ended up killing Thorn, honestly. The explanation or exclamation that Soylent Green is people is, well, I mean, him saying that, in a way, you think about it, it's almost futile. In a church of rundown people, in the future, the scene or the setting for that part with the church it reminds me of the scenes from the future from Chrono Trigger. And I doubt that many people even cared or heard Thorn, How many people heard Thorn, let alone cared? And what's funny, too, with the Chrono Trigger part is that, I wonder if that scene, if you know about Chrono Trigger and what I'm talking about, you might, if you know about Chrono Trigger and the part of the game I'm talking about, you might see the same thing I do, where maybe that part of the game is sort of inspired by Soylent Green in some ways. Offhand, I'm not going to look it up because of my setup, but I do wonder if, like in Chrono Trigger, there's the Geno Dome, which apparently the English version of Chrono Trigger calls it the Geno Dome, when originally in Japanese it's called the Genocide Dome. It's called the Genocide Dome. And I don't know if this was just something somebody last year I had watched Vinesauce play Chrono Trigger for like the 77th time. And people in the chat were saying, I'll never forget, people were saying Soylent Green in the chat. And I was wondering, I wonder, like, where the people turned. There's no food. There's no food in there was no food in the future in Chrono Trigger, so I do wonder in some ways maybe it was inspired by the movie. But anyway, I'm kind of getting off point. I think the church scenes in the movie were among the most important for the grim reality of the future. The priest was so overwhelmed trying to make room for all of the people, which make room, he apparently was saying make room, gotta make room, which may have been a reference to the original story. But anyway, the priest in the movie was so overwhelmed with trying to make room for people who desperately needed a place to stay. And at first, you think that he's overwhelmed because there's just so many people. But once you find out the secret to Soylent Green and you kind of rewatch the church parts, it becomes a lot clearer to me. The secret becomes clearer. The father was worried sick because if he didn't make enough room, then the people in the church would become food. And I think that was the biggest thing that to me was very obviously implied near the end of the movie. That was what was lying on the father's conscience. That if he didn't make room, these people would literally die. The lack of the ceremonies for the dead, of course, made the future depicted all the more bleak. The dead woman who was found outside the church with the child attached to her was probably turned into food. And I think about that scene. I didn't write this down in the review, but I just, thought about that, where, that woman had that child tied to her by a rope. And I wonder if it was like, did she have the child tied to her where if she dies, the child just has to die too? Or, I kind of think about that a little bit, like what exactly is implied with that. But anyway, the way it's depicted sometimes makes life all the more bleak, knowing that there were no more ceremonies. When you think about it, it is very bleak because I mean, not that the people in the movie knew, but you as the viewer, you're like, damn, that's so depressing, literally, because there's no future. In this future, you don't get a funeral. You're just disposed of. You're disposed of. That's what they call it, disposal. And everybody gets turned into food. Everybody is turned into food. And I think that is the most depressing part of the underlying story, where even Simonson, who's supposed to be this head honcho on the Soylent Corp board, he is murdered and still turned into food. He's disposed of. And the bleak... And on top of that, they're not even turned into good food. Despite all the death and the cattling of the dead bodies, there is still not enough food. That kind of also makes you think, though, like, there's still not enough food despite turning people into Soylent Green pellets. And to me, I think, well, doesn't that kind of show how Soylent Green isn't really, like, that's not really working, though, right? You're turning dead people into pellets, these weird-ass cracker-looking things, which I wonder, just like, how did they make those for the set? But anyway, that's supposed to be, like, made out of dead people, and what? You still don't have enough? Like, that doesn't make sense. But anyway, back to the parts I wrote. The riot scene, though, in the movie shows how, bleak and depressing this whole thing is, where, people got angry that there wasn't any more Soylent Green. And what's funny is that Simonson's killer ends up dying during this, which was first alluded to earlier in the movie. So the character, who is called Gilbert, he says that he wouldn't understand Simonson, I believe. I think he meant Simonson. He says, I wouldn't understand him even if I lived to be 100 years old. And the guy who gives him the assassination contract, if you want to call it that, the guy who gives him the contract says, you won't. He's like, I don't think I'll understand him if I live to be 100 years old. You won't. It's like, damn. And he didn't. Simonson's killer ends up getting killed. The, what do you want to call it? Bulldozer, the thing just lands on him and squishes him. And of course, now looking up, facts for the movie, apparently, interestingly, Gilbert's actor was one of the 2 people from the cast who actually made it to the real 2022. The only other person being so was Cheryl's actress, I can't remember her name, Taylor Lee. But anyway, Gilbert, though, was tasked with killing Simonson of Soylent Corp, but he clearly didn't know the reason why, which I found very interesting too. He never knew that Soylent Green was people, and it's very obvious, as this was made known through the dialogue. The way he asks Simonson, is this correct, shows me that the character was wondering if the murder was the right thing to do. He probably didn't want to kill anybody, but perhaps asking Simonson helped his conscience in some way. I couldn't help but imagine, like, okay, if I was the writer, I would probably, have the assassin be a little nervous, right? But I guess I just take it that I see it as if Gilbert knew the truth about Soylent Green, he wouldn't have asked Simonson those questions. So, of course, he didn't know the truth of what Soylent Green's really made out of. And going back to the riot scene, thinking about that first part, with the trucks, it's really grim. It wasn't really said, but it was implied to me that if people didn't get out of the way, they would be turned into food. And I'm kind of like, man, am I like overthinking this? But I'm like, no. In the movie, it literally says that they would be disposed of if they didn't get out of the way. And to me, I mean, what else do they call it? They literally say it, disposed of. They dispose of the dead bodies. So if you don't get out of the way, you're going to be disposed of in the trucks. And I'm like, that's crazy. So technically, Soylent is made out of living people too? That's those small things that I'm like, okay, is that being implied, or am I kind of like making that up? You know what I mean? And so, and that's a part with, I would say, the writing with this movie that they could have just done a bit more. Like, can you tell me a little more? Is that implied? Are you being for real? Whatever. So anyway, but that's very bleak, right? You could be living and just in the way and they'll still dispose of you. Like, damn. What I think sticks out, or probably when this movie first came out, especially, what stuck out to people was the clear disrespect of course, the dead, but also the living. You know, they disrespect the living and they disrespect the dead. And movies like this, not to get all crazy hippie like, but strangely enough, movies like this inspire people though. They see a potential dystopian reality and they swear that they'll change. Now, whether they do or not is up to them. Just like in Chrono Trigger, but the future refused to change, right? But, through movies, music, and art, these things uplift people to become the best versions of themselves. And Soylent Green is one of those movies that I really see having caused people to reflect on their lives and their potential future. Many people saw this movie and they see it when they watch it. Many people, when they watch it, see it as a warning. Even if they don't like it very much, they see that it's supposed to be a warning in some way. And of course, I could see it as one too. The hyperinflation isn't something really touched on. Once again, another thing that they didn't go more in depth on that they should have. But it is a core element in the background. For example, the jar of strawberry jam that you see at one point apparently cost $150. Apparently, if you adjusted that for inflation today, as of, February 2025, that $150 jam would be $1,111.29 USD. So that's still outrageous, but even more so, and even more relevant today. In early 2025, inflation is still a real issue. I do wish that this was touched on more in the movie, though I know it was one of the things that they decided deliberately to show more than tell. The irony did not escape me, though, how Thorne, who was supposed to be this New York cop, lived in a slum. And I thought it was very interesting. I thought about this later, but, it said a lot when you think about it, how Simonson, who's supposed to be a figure for the Soylent Corp, was still renting an apartment. Nobody owned anything, which is a little too relevant to places right now. Despite it not being a more truthful adaptation to the literature, I do believe, crazy enough, probably to some people, that Soylent Green was a necessary movie to make. I think it, in some ways, it did have to be done. I do. Though the idea became more morbid for Hollywood, I believe it was on purpose, though, to invoke a more emotional reaction out of people. They set out to change the world, and in some ways they did just that. A movie like this will stay in the public consciousness for a long time, if not all time. I hadn't seen it anywhere online before or after watching the movie, but I did wonder if Soylent was among some of the first films of its time to use an integrated cast, the way it did, especially. I didn't research offhand, looking, I don't know, but I just thought, okay, this was recorded in 72. came out in 73, and this was still pretty early into, you know, what was it? This was still rather early into America's integration, you know. This was really early into America's desegregation. Still, of course, many people I know, you know, my own family members were born in the 70s, but at that point in time, there were still many adults who would never think it possible for a black man to be a white man's boss or for there to be interracial relationships. And these are things that you and I would think of as just small today. Like, who cares? This black guy's living with this. Wait, I have that backwards. You know, today, most of us wouldn't think anything of it, of, you know, a black guy being a white guy's boss. It's just whatever. You know, nobody would think anything of, you know, a white guy and a black girl living together. You know, I mean, it's just normal today. It's just whatever. It's just people, you know. You don't think like this black guy is the boss. Like, no, that's just his boss. That's all I saw it as, you know. Oh, that's his boss. Oh, that's, you know, the chick he lives with. And, but I thought about it afterwards. I was like, you know, when this movie came out, they didn't say anything about race at all. And I think that must have blew people's minds, right? You know. But strangely enough, I didn't see anything like, you know, on Wikipedia or IMDb or anything. I never saw anybody talk about, like, any sort of reaction to the race thing, which is good, you know, in many ways. But it was also kind of just interesting. Like, I don't think people even noticed it. I don't know. It seems most people didn't even notice it either. I don't know. But anyway, so I looked through the newspaper archives, whatever, to see what was originally said about the movie. I was mostly curious about how people reviewed or thought of the movie when it first came out. Because a lot of movies like this, like Soylent Green and a lot of zombie movies. God, I'm hungry. But a lot of movies in like the horror and thriller sci-fi genres are a lot of cult classics are hated at first. Let's just put it like that. And so I was curious how public opinion was in 1973. And mostly on top, what am I saying? Especially because when I looked on Wikipedia, it kind of said, you know, it wasn't really favored very well. So, on April 27th, 1973, the Miami News posted an article titled, The Miami News posted an article titled, Soylent Green is simply awful. The writer stated that Edward G. Robinson was the highlight of the film, which I agree, and which the film itself was otherwise weak and poorly acted. They stated that Soylent Green is a badly staged film about people going backwards into the future. It supposedly takes place in New York City in 2022 after overpopulation, pollution, and industrial rape have ruined comfortable life on Earth. Supposedly, the city's population is 40 million, with 20 million out of work. And it's interesting to me that the article says this last part, because in the movie, I don't recall it saying that there were 20 million out of work. I know that at the beginning, like the first scene, so to speak, you know, it shows New York City, population 40 million, right? And that's the thing, and I want to point that out too. It says in the movie that there were 40 million people in New York City. Now, looking at articles later on, it said that there were 40 million people in Manhattan Island alone. And I got a little confused about that because I was like, I don't remember hearing that. Which I think that might have been something that people took from the novel and not the movie. But moving on, the article stated that there's various details that were not in the movie, or the article states details that were not in the movie or not discussed in the film. But I did end up seeing in trailers. And I thought that this was a stupid move. I mean, why didn't they have those important details in the movie? But they had it in the trailers. Of course, I know that back then, there were typically you'll see. I remember as a child, basically, you would see scenes in trailers that ended up not ending up in the movie. And they ended up being deleted scenes. But anyway, this was still a wasted opportunity to me, and it left me confused as to why certain characters did certain things. They didn't say in the movie, they really didn't explain the furniture or concubine escort thing. In the movie itself, it's not explained on its own. I was just confused. I was like, okay, so I guess these chicks are like bought with the apartment or something. It wasn't until after I watched the movie and I had watched trailers for it and, of course, read news articles and saw advertisements for the movie when it first came out that it said, the furniture thing, women are furniture. Why didn't they explain that in the movie? I don't know. Anyway, the article goes on to argue that Soylent's premise didn't make much sense as technology was more likely to become important in the future, and of course they were right. I think that in general we can agree that the writers to the movie didn't get too far in the details of their own plot. And this is something that the grand majority of people that reviewed this movie when it came out said. This is something when it first came out, people complained about, that there were just not enough details explained. Another article by The Republican was posted on April 20th, 1973, and it reviews Soylent Green, calling it weak and depressing. The author wrote that Soylent's story is, of course, weak, and everything about this film is depressing. They stated that not once does the film ever show an emotional strain. I agree with that because you're not really attached to any of the characters. You don't get attached to any of them, honestly. And the script was described as monotone, and the film was like a badly baked pie dropped on the floor. That's a great description. A badly baked pie dropped on the floor. So, but this review also, of course, acknowledges Edward G. Robinson as the star of the film, his acting sticking out the most. Of course, I agree with that. Robinson's acting really was the best in the film. I take back what I said earlier. I think that the only character that was worth caring about was Saul Roth, which was played by Robinson, because you can't help but connect with a character that was based on essentially somebody today, right? A person that I guess you would say call a real person, someone that's like you and me. There's supposed to be someone like you and me that at least grew up with real lettuce and tomatoes and meat, but with the way the environment, everything fell apart. He didn't have it anymore. And so for when you saw Saul be so almost brought to tears, or if he didn't cry, when he saw the real food, all the things that Thorne brought back. My point is just that Edward G. Robinson really made Saul worth caring about. He did. That is the only character, seriously. If anything, I would say that Saul Roth is the only reason to rewatch this movie. Truly. A small review of the movie was posted by the Greenville News on April 30th, 1973. They were among some of the viewers who felt that Charlton Heston's acting was robotic. Another review having called him flat. This review stated that Heston's acting had taken a steady trend for the worse. And I do agree that Heston was pretty boring, honestly. Though I see a lot of Heston's acting to me, a lot of how his role, a lot of Heston's acting and Chuck Connor's role is very reminiscent. It's part of those old traces of Hollywood that I was talking about before. It's still very old Hollywood. There's a lot of old acting in it, you know. If you've seen other movies from the 50s and 60s, you know what I mean. And I thought, though, that this review in particular was interesting mainly for the end, in which they stated, I am in complete agreement with Soylent Green that uncontrolled population expansion will eventually do our way of life in, and something must be done to counteract the impending problem. I do not agree that the solution is what Soylent Green suggests, no matter how bad a shape we humans get the world into. And of course I agree with that. I agree with that quote. Mainly the part that we won't be making food out of dead people. Realistically, it would be too risky, and there'd be too many variables like diseases to filter through. Will we ever make food out of people? No, I don't think so. I mean, most people probably wouldn't even taste good anyway. You'd have to throw everything out. But on top of that aside, though, one thing I did notice about reviews from this time period, a lot of people talked about the overpopulation problem. You know, I agree, overpopulation is bad, it's getting worse, da da da. And I've always wondered about this. This is something I grew up with hearing, right? I was born in the 90s and raised by Gen X parents. And a lot of people in Gen X and the baby boomers always say, oh, the world's overpopulated, da da da. But apparently there is enough room for everybody. There is enough food for everybody. The problem is of course, distribution of wealth, the distribution of food and just things in general to people and places. I never understood, why are we calling everything overpopulated? This is just speculation or anecdotal, but while reading these reviews from the 70s, I couldn't help but wonder, was the baby boom after World War II the reason why people thought the world was becoming overpopulated? This is a genuine question I have. Are the baby boomers, you know, because this is that was a generation that literally exploded, you know, it exploded in growth and births and all that. Huge trend. A lot of people from that time period were born, and maybe that's why they thought everything is overpopulated, just because that was a much bigger generation than the ones before it, and so there wasn't room. But just because we had to build houses in the 50s doesn't mean there isn't any room. I don't know. I'm kind of rambling, but this is something I thought about, you know. Did people think we were overpopulated because there was a baby boom? Or what? I've never understood that. Once again, I think that just comes from being someone on the other side of the spectrum, you know. I forgot to write it down in this interview, but I can definitely say it was pretty clear that the writers, directors of the movie, they did not anticipate anybody watching this in the future. It's pretty clear. They definitely didn't think someone will watch this movie 3 years post the actual 2022. Like, so someone like me, I'm in the middle, you know, right? So anyway, an article was posted on February 7th, 1973, and it talks a bit about the depressing movie and points of integration. This was one of the very few bits I found that did kind of talk a little bit about the race stuff. This article said that Chuck Connors was quoted as stating, "The overpopulation and overpollution is real enough today. The trees are dying at Big Bear. It's all happening now. This picture is projected truth, not science fiction." Interestingly, it seems that the integrated parts in the movie happened without any planning. When describing the girls in the movie, the furniture girls, the script just called for 8 beautiful girls. There's no mention of anybody's color. My assumption is that by then we'll have grown up. A quote from the producer, Walter Seltzer. The Atlanta Journal wrote about the movie unfavorably, claiming that it was nauseating enough to kill my appetite, allowing me to stay on a diet this weekend. They also called the movie gruesome and dull. Personally, I didn't think it was that bad, but, The Times wrote that the movie was something most people would enjoy, but could make you weep when you think of the enormously powerful thing it might have been. If only its emphasis had been slightly different. And I agree with that. The sci-fi plot of a dystopian future has lots of potential, especially as a book, and I really do feel the movie did not go as deep as it could have. I know I kept saying that before. It's not like the future wasn't a topic people weren't interested in, people, sci-fi, space, all of that kind of stuff. Just look at Star Wars, which only came out a few years later in 1977. A whole new world that had deep lore and instantly interested people. Soylent could have gone deep like that, but it didn't. Not too many articles touched on the women's roles in the film. Usually they would just have a quick sentence that stated, that beautiful women come in the apartments for the rich. Some articles, on the other hand, would try to make a tasteless joke about it, usually about how it was like something of their desires. One article from the Shreveport Journal said, Gloria Steinem and her women libbers are going to hate this picture. Gloria Steinem at the time was a very popular feminist. The Philadelphia News wrote that Soylent Green was non-essential and stomach upsetting. The Des Moines Tribute made the great point that the film has a lot of build-up to ultimately let the viewer down. And I can understand that sentiment. The Evansville Press wrote that Soylent tried too many things on too many levels to make it pleasing, and in the end was not a satisfying film. The Daily Messenger made a great point when they asked the question, if the world is ruled by an elite with police to do their bidding, why would the rulers put up with the breeding, overpopulated world? Why not tuck a little poison or birth control into the Soylent foods? This movie has more holes in it than moth heaven. And articles like the Acton Gazette wrote that they enjoyed the film but still had questions about the Soylent world, such as, what other instances of power did the Soylent Corp have? And that's a good question. Other papers wrote of Soylent as boring, outlandish, dull, the plot mishandled, that it missed the mark, overwrought, thin. I don't know if this is even a real word, cinematographically, this doesn't count in my word processor. Maybe they meant cinematography, I don't know. But cinematographically unrewarding. It was also written as a thriller in need of recycling, and the script is starved for lack of wit or intelligence. Ironically, The Independent thought that Soylent Green was great. They said that it was most likely to succeed. They had really high hopes for the movie and wanted people to know. Or perhaps they were paid for the review. Bought out. The Journal and Courier wrote that Soylent was message-laden tripe that tries to pawn itself off as art. They said, the year 2022 is 49 years away. It's unlikely that in these next 5 decades, women's rights, our democratic society, the environment, motherhood, birth control, apple pie, Uncle Sam, everything will fall apart. The film advertised itself as a story of a man's survival in a man's destroyed environment. Hogwash. The film does not take an educated approach to the very real and serious environmental problems, but capitalized on them by using monster movie scare notions. And I agree with all of that, actually. The more articles I read about Charlton Heston and Soylent Green, it really appeared to me that Heston, by 1973, was one of those out-of-touch, rich Hollywood types that were advocating for things that were pretty far from the real issues going on in people's lives. Not necessarily what the environmental consciousness of Soylent Green was supposed to be, but other things that were talked about. Not trying to get too crazy or flag YouTube by saying this, but Heston wanted to point out the actions, the things that Planned Parenthood was doing. And I don't want to get into Planned Parenthood, whether you agree with it or not, but my kind of basis is that to me, he seemed like he was out of touch compared to the other things going on in the 70s, which, from what I've heard and read a little bit about, was a rather tumultuous time for the economy. The Mercury wrote, conservatively speaking, it's a horrible ecological story. They wrote that Soylent would have and could have been well-made and intelligent, but it tries to show mankind in a desperate situation where everything has gone wrong, and in doing so, it becomes vitiated and enfeebled. To be fair, the person that wrote that article in particular, they were using a lot of big words, and it made the review turn more into holier-than-thou jargon as opposed to making a point. And speaking of holy, strangely enough, there were a couple of articles I found that contemplated, believe it or not, yes, the religious aspect of the film and how someone could relay the message of the movie to their Christian faith. Whatever. The Sydney Morning Herald did point out that the women were oppressed in the future with their furniture positions. And that's a lot better than what Bernard Giroux of the Democrat and Chronicle wrote, calling Cheryl a wistful whore. The strangest part about Soylent Green was how it had a promotional where you could meet the furniture girls. An ad from the Chicago Tribune, dated April 5th, 1973, stated, "Meet the furniture girls from Soylent Green at Wick's." Wick's furniture store. The promotion was to give 2 passes to see Soylent Green to the first 100 people that arrived. And people could come and talk to the girls and get autographs. There was another promotional that was seen in the News Tribune, posted on April 18th, 1973. You could meet the Soylent Green girls in moderate sportswear on April 20th of that year, and what looks like Washington. It mentioned something about Tacoma. The girls would be wearing clothes that were sold at the store and were to hand out free tickets and survival kits. I do not know what the survival kits look like. I have never heard or seen anything about that. So, if you know anything about the Soylent Green survival kits, please let me know. Leave a comment. I am very curious. Sounds like something from Steve MRE, 1989. The Statesville Record and Landmark posted an article on May 12, 1973, stating that there were four of the furniture girls who were going on tour to promote the movie. Some of the cities included New Orleans, Houston, Miami, Chicago, and Detroit. The girls were to travel in high style, with each receiving a set of matched luggage from Samsonite's Luggage, their silhouette line. All of the luggage would have Soylent Green decals on them. The girls carried clothes from Court Fashions of California, which they were to model at leading department stores. And it's just funny to me that the women who played the roles were essentially exploited for this film. Honestly, it seems very tone deaf. I mean, how is it not tone deaf for them to have done this? That the women who played these characters that were essentially being sexually trafficked, seen as objects and called furniture, would then be expected to go to a furniture store and promote the movie. It, is that not what the movie was trying to warn about? Or does it not matter because they were sexually attractive? I just don't see why Charlton Heston couldn't have done more to promote the movie. It's things like that, though, that turn where there are holes, holes in the movie that, holes in the movie and kind of just outside of it that just didn't make sense when making it. And they turned into like giant chasms. These holes turned into giant chasms, which makes just all of this fall apart. At the end of the day, I'd recommend seeing the movie once. By yourself, just watch it once. Just to say you did it. Because that's kind of why I did it. Just to say, like, yeah, I need to do it. Get it off the list, right? And also, I would say, hey, you need to watch this movie because when Simonson was on the floor, supposed to be dead, you could clearly see him breathing. Clearly. Once again, it was like this strangely low budget aspect to a movie that had, I guess, big names. So anyway, I would give Soylent Green 3 out of 5 stars. I know that sounds kind of high in comparison to what I said, but to me it's just more like average slop, unsurprisingly bad, and I mean, like, I knew it was going to be bad, but I wasn't really surprised, And it's a loose adaptation of a story that goes nowhere. I mean, come on, nobody said this, but let's be real. You had source material. You had it essentially written out for you. You decided to add something completely different from the original story, and you still fucked it up. That doesn't make sense. I mean, maybe I should say 2. Not really 3. Maybe I should really say 2 out of 5 stars. Because the more you think about it, the worse it gets. If you just watch the movie for what it is, I would say 3 out of 5. But when you look into the details and you start thinking about it and you're like, that really doesn't make any sense. It's more of a 2. So anyway, if you had someone like George Romero or Tom Savini to have made this, or back when George was still alive, if he remade the film, it would have been great. I mean, I think of how Tom Savini made or remade Night of the Living Dead for the 1990 release. That was so good. So good. Could you imagine if he had remade Soylent Green? That would have been great. In fact, I thought initially that Soylent Green was inspired by Night of the Living Dead, of course, the original from the 60s. Because at least in certain camera angles and with the extras, it kind of gave off the vibe of what it reminded me of the things that Romero and co did for that original movie. And speaking of, one of the articles stated that they hired nearly 6,000 extras. It was like 5,600 and some change. But nearly 6,000 extras to record all of the New York scenes in the film for Soylent Green. Yes, crazy. Which, yeah, that's nuts. But on a slime scale, if we're going to look at it in a kind of crappy Troll 2 type of way, I would give Soylent Green 1 slime. It's bad, but not as entertainingly so. It's not hilarious bad, like I could like to call things like Troll 2. Troll 2, what was that one movie? Well, that one was not very, funny, though, the slime people. But Troll 2, The Room, those are hilarious bad. Those are 4, 5 slime movies. But Soylent Green is 1, It's bad, but, you could tell, they had tried to do things to make it cool. But You know, the movie has this low budget feel despite it acting like it's supposed to be more than that. You know, and that's the weird part. They did all this promotional for it. You know, they had these furniture girls, and the movie is made kind of crappily. You know, it's pretty low quality. To me, it's bad because it doesn't try enough in the good areas, and it goes and it goes too hard in the boring ones. There's a lot of potential for Soylent Green, but unfortunately, they wasted it. They had more than enough time, I would say. Soylent Green had a lot of potential, but they didn't use it, and that's their own fault.